talked about this sort of the approach to services. There are two contrasting approaches. One is the experientialization, emotionalization of services to one extreme, and the other is the more engineering approach to services, right? So we saw that today as well. So engineering versus psychology, and also somewhere bringing these two together as well. We saw that in the afternoon panel. Let me open this up to Q&A, and I think there are already people waiting, and then we'll also chat amongst the panelists. So that's wonderful.
Thanks for some really interesting presentations. Actually, I think that the idea that you have the IoT Renaissance of engineering is actually a really lovely idea. But it does actually, for me, sort of contrast quite starkly with the concept of I think that you were talking about sorry, is it Gomoloso? Thank you. Because it does seem to me that sort of process takes the student not as the product, so it's not education in and of itself, but it seems to take the firm as the sort of customer of the service of education. And I was just wondering, because I think both points might be valid actually, but I was wondering, do you guys have some comments on the sort of inherent sort of tension there between the two things you've just said?
Is this on? So I would, in the interest of debate, say there's absolutely no contrast at all. In fact, they're a wonderful complement. And so this idea of the T-shaped individual is both pictorially and conceptually very close to what we're talking about. You want education to teach the kids the vertical, the stem of the T, that is the skills and competencies and real depth in what they do. And then you want them to learn the horizontal of the T, which is collaboration, which is working in teams, which is emotional, which is empathetic, which is able to cross boundaries. And education is not doing a great job of that right now, we don't think, but the mentoring idea between industry and education, and actually working on a project and having problems and having failures and solving things because you can't write, or your English is broken, or you can't write code, and working with somebody else who can, and crossing that. So becoming that T-shaped person is, by some act of cosmic fate, exactly the Renaissance engineer, because you get comfortable with crossing boundaries, which is one of the things I heard Professor Brzezinski say, while also learning some great depth. So that's my take.
Well, this was a great question and a great response, so I don't know what to add to it. But seriously, I think this notion of T-shapedness is very intriguing, because if we think about it, a lot of existing well-functioning systems are based on the concept of T-shape. And I was looking around the world looking for existing examples of organizations and structures, and trying to identify, trying to essentially to make a judgment if a given organization is T-shaped or to what extent it is T-shaped oriented. And I found quite a lot of organizations which fit into this picture. For example, in my opinion, and I can be wrong, the best health service organization in the world is the Mayo Clinic. But if you go there and you see what happens there, how a patient is treated, that's exactly what they do. This is a T-shaped approach. When there's a focus on the patient, so there's a specialist associated with the patient, assigned to the patient, but at the same time, immediately, everything what the Mayo Clinic has at its disposal is available, which provides this breadth, availability of services. So I think there's some kind of universal stigma to this very simple idea of this T-shape. And I think we can think a little bit about that. And obviously the rest of it, what you just said about bringing the gap and publicizing this T-shape idea from the standpoint of interaction between academia and industry also does fit into this picture, right? When you have essentially one side depth, let's say from the academic standpoint, but you can reverse the situation and you can use this depth from the industrial standpoint. So once again, we have this association with T-shapedness. Thank you. Anybody else? Anybody else? From the panel?
If I may, I think the one thing that you asked, and correct me if I'm mistaken, the Glomo-So idea is to be able to take that which happens in the 30-student classroom with a great professor, and can you extend that to 1 million people so that they can get the benefit, not from just the teacher, but in socializing it among their peers, and you create a whole other system that's based on these platforms and the socialization that is yet to happen. But the promise of it happening means that we can scale. Because I think your question, part of your question was on scale, was it not?
Well, no, my question was, your colleague to your left is speaking about using IoT to basically check out like a library book. But for me, that is a fundamentally different model to sitting in a lecturing tool with 30 other students. So,
Other questions? Yes.
This is a question about the students as customers and how we provide service to students as customers and how we do things that are difficult. I was really struck when I read an article about a famous pianist. It was in the New Yorker magazine, and one summer he was trying to become a real pianist. And his teacher said, okay, this summer you're going to have something to do that is really hard. You're going to have to learn how to play thirds and fifths and octaves and tenths and other things and really do them well. And you're going to really hate it. But when you're finished, you'll actually be a pianist. And what I have the feeling about in my kind of average university that I teach at is that we don't really do that. We don't try to do that. We do kind of softball stuff. And this year I decided I would do what one of my colleagues was doing that I hadn't done before, which is I'm giving them 4 simulations in a row. And every one of the simulations adds additional difficulty. And they've got to do spreadsheets and figure out stuff. I'm not telling them exactly what to do in advance. And frankly, I think most of them hate it. And most of them are kind of angry at me for not telling them exactly what to do and exactly how to do every last thing in those simulations. And my colleague has provided pretty good videos about exactly what to do. And it's a really good example, I think, of how are we really going to do service for our students when our students may not be the customers who want those services.
You bring up a good point, and I think part of the issue, what I try to do when I have situations like that, is set the expectations ahead of time, and you can give them certain guidelines in terms of what you're expecting, and tell them it's going to be difficult, and tell them it's going to be challenging, but there's some good coming out at the other end. We're competing for students' time, and they have a lot of other things to do besides study. I saw one study, it said 7% of the students' week is spent studying. I think it was something like this, like ridiculous. And so we got to find ways to motivate them and get them to put us as a top priority. I digress for 1 second. One of the things I do in my undergraduate class is I give them a quiz every day, but I let them participate in the decision process. So we start off the day, and I think you used the word in your paper there about control. The customer has control. So I let them think they have control. So I say, we have to have quizzes in this course. You have a choice. I can give you every day. I can give them what I want to give them, or we can flip a coin. What do you think they pick every time? Flip the coin. Okay? And the feedback I get, like one student, that's what it said, one student, what do you hate most about that course that Davis teaches? He gives a quiz every day. What do you like best about the course that Davis teaches? He gives a quiz every day. I have to give it to my class. So I think somewhat setting expectations and let them recognize there's something good coming out at the end. Because I think a lot of the courses students take are very, at least in the business school, are very theory-based, and they don't understand how they can make that link to practicality, and therefore they don't see any interest in learning it. I don't know if that helps.
Let me add that that's what makes education as a service industry interesting, right? I'm reminded of this comment. I think it was one of the past presidents of Brown University who said, education is the preparation for an appointment that has not been made yet. You know, so that's still very fresh in my mind. So that's one of the challenges. You know, these students are not really customers. They don't exactly know what is needed to succeed in the future. We don't know either. So I think that's why the T model is actually quite interesting because it gives you that depth. It prepares you. It doesn't say that you should treat them as customers. You're preparing the T-shaped worker of the future, and with the combination of the depth, and rigor of the past, with the holistic thinking, the breadth, which is required for most outcome-oriented approaches, like we discussed in the morning. It would really prepare them for jobs of the future. It would seem like. Anybody else?
I would just observe also, I think the student may not be the customer, or if they are, they're certainly not the only customer. And as we look at, through the work that we've been doing, we're looking at industry as the customer. So if we look at what industry wants to consume in terms of the output of the universities, we're looking at, and it's not the only perspective, but is the university producing an output that the customer, in this case industry, can consume. So that may be less about degree of difficulty and more about degree of fit. And the gap that we were talking about was the gap between industry as customer and university as the provider. So both are valid, but I'm saying that we're looking at it through a different lens.
This is again a great comment from the audience, and I would like to respond. Once again, thinking about what's happening with this invasion of MOOC. I'm a big believer that the internet and the Internet of Things is going to change everything dramatically. But at the same time, I'm emphasizing this Renaissance side because I don't want my students, myself, and the rest of the society to lose our human face. And coming back to what teaching is all about, this is about the relationship between a student and a professor. And as much as I can sound in a very conservative way, very, very important is to develop this relationship and look at the virtues which makes you as a professor special, which means that you have to be honest to your students, you have to develop trust to your students, you have to develop this relationship in such a way that they trust you, because they don't know. They come to a university to learn something. So by definition, they don't know what they are going to learn and how they are going to learn. This is your job to make sure that they are not wasting their time. I would like to emphasize very, very strongly, once again, this personal relationship between a student and a professor. Thank you.
I have a quick read. Just another question. This is Lisa Kirsch from Bentley University. Thank you for a really rich panel discussion. I enjoyed just that you mentioned the different dimensions of students, the emotional piece, the service taking, the partnerships that you're building. I was struck by one question that Jeff raised, and it was one of your slides. How do we enable people everywhere to discover innovative approaches? And I'm really interested in questions of access and diversity and to be more inclusive. This morning I was I had my misgivings a little bit about when Martin spoke, it just said that who benefits. And there was no question of who doesn't benefit, who is excluded. And I'm so wondering if people thought about that. I think higher education is still very limited. You mentioned diversity was on one of the slides, inclusion, mentorship, all of these things. I'm just curious if you've thought about that, and I think that question, how do we enable people everywhere, is a really profound one, and I'm not sure how we get there, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on any of the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a lot easier to raise the question than it is to give an answer, quite honestly. If you take a look at Wikipedia or Linux, no one, including the people who developed it, could have anticipated that people from all over the world would want to contribute to the benefit of humankind. So the question is how can we create platforms and systems in which people can learn from one another, not that the developing world is teaching we're teaching them, but that we're coming up with access so that people can find their own solutions rather than us social engineering them. That's some of it. And the other is that there is a groundswell of change among young people because so many of them have mobile devices. What they have access to in mobile devices, they are using Twitter in Saudi Arabia and in other places where they never had access to open information or even to discuss with one another. So some of what we're hearing is when you allow people to connect with one another and you give them the tools, they themselves will come up with ways to create innovative solutions for themselves, which is part of the democratization and part of building institutions in areas where they never had a chance.